So I know several of you in the room and a few of you guys are new faces to me, but my name, if you haven't met me, is Isaac Madsen. I'm the extension agronomist for oilseeds in Washington State. And I originally titled this talk Increasing Biodiversity and Active Root Growth in Dryland Agriculture in the Inland Pacific Northwest. I think a better title of it is maybe Beyond No-Till or Beyond Cover Cropping. What are some other means that we can use to increase the diversity in our systems and increase the length of time that we have active root growth going on. So yeah, before I get started, I'm in my current position, I'm oilseed focused. This is the program I'm on, but I still work on a variety of things, including some wheat pathogen work, and then what I'm going to talk about today, and a little bit on soil health also. And when I took the new job, I sort of divided my research into two categories, what I call the business as usual, sort of working on stand establishment and fertility in canola, and then crazy ideas. I understand you could debate these some, but I'm just going to work off of them. I'm not going to spend time testing whether they're true or not. But just crop diversity is beneficial for long-term soil health. I'm going to work under that assumption, and then increasing the time during which plant roots or plants are actively rooting is beneficial, essentially. Right, and these are two assumptions we're frequently making now, and I'm going to stick with them and stay away from the theory. And so I'm going to talk about two practices that I see promise for in the region that are not cover cropping and that are moving hopefully beyond no-till and into some improved practices for soil health in our region. So the first is intercropping, and specifically legume oilseed intercropping, which I've started to work on and done a little bit of reading and touring around on. And then the second one is integrated livestock or dual purpose canola. So where we're growing the canola for seed and for feed or forage rather. So the general sort of theories behind intercropping is that you increase the crop diversity in the field, and thereby you increase the microbial diversity, and you start to fill out ecological niches that a monocrop would leave in the system. And so you actually get increased resource use efficiency either over time or space. And this is actually, if you look at a lot of, I guess, ancient or pre-industrial agricultural systems and a lot of systems in subsistence agriculture, they actually are still using some sort of intercropping in those systems. And as we mechanized agriculture, we essentially had to move away from this. And I think especially with where we are in the mechanization process, maybe we can start moving back towards this, or at least that's my hope. So separation in time, there's some different ways we can do that. We can do relay cropping here, where we have one crop, and then as it starts, so this is your resource demand over time, and then this is your crop growth over time. And so basically we can look at offsetting those. And so can anybody think of what an example of this would be? A system, not in the Northwest maybe, but that would use this kind of idea. So when you screw up and plant peaola too early, that would be one, right? So in that instance, right, if your soils are cool, the peas come early, right, and then the canola comes later. And so you've offset that resource demand in time, which isn't ideal in that situation. The real common one we're hearing about now, right, is people flying cover crop seed or a forage mix onto maize at the end of the season if you have an opportunistic rain. So probably not well suited to our environment, but definitely an option that's out there in other places, right? So what you're doing there is your corn has used up your resources throughout the growing season, you're getting ready to harvest it, and then you put on your cover crop or your forage. Another way to look at this, and this is can be considered also a companion crop or a nurse crop, depending on how you're using it, is you sow them at the same time, and then one of your plants stops using the resources halfway through. So here's sort of when we're looking at crop growth, right? We have these two crops growing together, and then one levels off. Alfalfa stand establishment is one, right, where people frequently cut it with oats. So use the oats to get the alfalfa up. You're not actually using the oats at all, but you are actually introducing some diversity into that system. And thanks to Aaron Esser, we've been actually running some experiments with doing that with canola. So here's oats and canola. Aaron planted some plots out at the Wilkie farm, and he basically planted oat seeds in with his canola seeds. And you can see here they're growing together, and one of the fun things to look at in this when we talk about microbial diversity, right? So we know oats have arbuscular mycorrhizae and the canola doesn't have arbuscular mycorrhizae growing on the roots. And also, if you just dig them up, what was interesting to me is the probably loosely bound rhizosphere on there, how much more loosely bound rhizosphere you actually have on those oats versus the canola. We're interested in this from a stand establishment and winter survival perspective. And so here's when we went through and did counts this fall for stand establishment. Basically what we got was averages that were fairly similar to each other. But the thing I'd like to note, this is orange line is with the oats, is that we actually have a more narrow distribution. So we're going to keep looking at that and see if that repeats over time, right? Because we're not just interested in can we get the right stand count, but can we get a consistent stand count across the field, right? We want stand consistency, not just a good stand count. And then the final one is synchronous in time, right? So the resource demand is synchronous in time, so we have to offset it in space or some other way, or offset it in the pools of nutrients and resources that we can access. And so this is the example here, they're growing together. And this is the example with peaola. How many people had heard the term peaola before today? Peaola is just, the Canadians and Australians have started calling it that. It's a pea canola intercrop. They're mostly working with spring peaola. I'm mostly interested in winter peaola out in the grain fallow region. Although I think there could be some fits in the spring area. That the main issue I see with that is most of the time when I run into growers who are producing spring canola, it's usually for that Roundup Ready trait, and it's usually to get control on weeds. So we don't have a Roundup Ready pea available, so there's not a lot of sense necessarily in pursuing that route at this point in time. There are non-Roundup Ready varieties of canola out there. They're just not as popular as spring canola. So I drew this cartoon, so forgive me if something doesn't line up with just how you see the plants in your field. But here on the left we have the peas, right? So I drew these, the root system here, taproot architecture, right? What I know from having dug in winter pea fields is you aren't accessing the deep moisture very often, even in winter peas, so even with that higher yield. But I drew nodules on there. I even put them pink for marin, right? So we're saying that we have some active fixation. And then also our arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, right? So peas actually do have that symbiosis, or can have that symbiosis. Versus canola, what we know about canola is it accesses deep nutrients and water, right? So this is the offset in space I'm talking about, right? So the canola is accessing your deeper resources. The peas are accessing your shallower resources, and then with the AMF and the nodulation is actually accessing pools that aren't available to the canola. So that's kind of how the theory behind this goes, and why we might see these as actually being well suited ecologically to go together. That doesn't mean it's going to work in an agricultural setting necessarily, right? But there's some potential for it to work. I think this is a good opportunity then to sort of stack diversity, right? Neither of these crops are new crops to this region, right? So I know growers that are in a fallow wheat, fallow pea, fallow wheat rotation, and they might sneak canola in there somewhere, but this allows us to double that diversity in that non-wheat year. It also offers us an opportunity to keep AMF during our canola part of the rotation, when we're usually starving the AMF out during that particular part of the rotation. So there's some more thoughts on what could be going on there. Here's a video I have of the video of peaola then growing, so you get to see the pea root and some nodulation here in a second. So there's a pea root. So those are the root hairs here. Note how short they are. So that's a characteristic of the pea roots, is those shorter root hairs. And then up here we'll get a nodule in a bit. So it's growing out right here. So it's kind of fun to see. And you can actually see it's a little bit of a pinkish tint right there. So probably an active nodule, hopefully an active nodule going on there. And then eventually the canola root will come down. The thing that I kind of want to highlight when the canola root comes in, it'll come in right about here, is how long the root hairs are. So the root hairs go all the way out to there actually. And they're actually touching these nodules. You can note this nodule up here on the side starts to die off. and then this nodule stays pretty big here. But you can imagine that if these are leaking much nitrogen at all, it's going to be available probably to the canola. There's not a lot of hard evidence yet pointing to the idea that we actually are getting transfer of nitrogen, but I'm sure that kind of thing could be achieved with isotope work, right? To tell where it's coming from. So that's kind of one of the fun things we're doing. And so this is just emphasizing some of the things that we may have seen in that video here. One of the interesting things, right, we know that canola doesn't have AMF, but it grows these really nice root hairs, long root hairs. So it might be something of a compensatory effect where it's trying to get more surface area than the peas, and the peas are basically forming symbiosis, and that's how they're getting more access to the nutrients. So a few different things we can think about. So does this really work is sort of the next question, right? We can talk all day about theories. If we don't get anything that actually we can make work, we're kind of stuck and not making real progress. So here's I went up to Canada this summer with Dave Huggins, and we toured quite a few fields, some research stations, and then some fields that were actually in production. So this is actually a production field here, and this is a three-way mix. It's got canola, peas, and lentils, and obviously in that mix you can't hardly see the lentils, but they're sort of there on the lower level. And the grower that we were visiting, Canada, kind of had a weird year this year for stand establishment. So they said it was probably one of their worst years for canola establishment. He said usually you would have quite a bit more canola going on, but he's pretty much switched his whole operation to this, and he's doing thousands of acres now of intercrop. So maybe that's just the region he's in, but there's a few growers now in Canada, sort of just north of North Dakota, that are doing this. And I know that doesn't directly translate to our region. So if we're going to try this in our region, we're going to have to develop some different techniques and mess around with it a little bit. But I think there's some potential there. It's an interesting one, a camelina lentil mix here. I dug up the roots in this field, and one of the things that was really striking as you dig this up, this is the camelina plant here, and then the lentil plant here, and it's almost impossible to separate the roots when these plants are growing together. They just end up almost 100% intertwined. You get this massive root ball. So that's where it's definitely not my role, but I think with people like Tara and Marion, there's a lot of work to probably be done on signaling between the plants and microbial work. Same thing here, looking at the roots, and you can just see all of the nodules going on in there. So a lot of nodules, and then that's in with the camelina roots. So it's all right there. Another really popular one, intercrop that I got to see a lot of up there, is this flax and chickpea mix. This one's interesting because the actual theory on it that is sort of traditionally chickpeas weren't really growing out that way because too much fungicides were needed with the humidity they have in the summers. But what they're finding is when they intercrop it with the flax, they're actually able to reduce their fungicide applications quite a bit. And so there's not really anything pinned down, but they think that the ascotida blight essentially won't spread as fast in a field if you have the flax in there as a barrier. And they've looked at it, different ways of doing it. So they've looked at doing every other row or just mixing everything up and throwing it in a bin and planting it all together, and it doesn't seem to make a huge difference actually which way they're doing it, as long as you get good stands of both in the field. And a lot of this at this point is sort of anecdotal evidence, and this is one of the few research stations. So most of the people we talked to about this were actual farmers, production farmers. But here's a research station sort of further east where they were actually doing some work on it. Really fun one here is sunflowers, and I believe vetch in this one, and then sunflowers and peas in this guy here. So those are some of the things that are out there that people are trying, and some of which are actually going into production. Obviously there's a ton of challenges. There's a lot of logistical difficulties that need overcome. I think the two most difficult ones to think about are cleaning the seeds. So this is one of the farmers that we went to his farm and visited. He started out with just this normal cylinder cleaner. Well, actually, I think he started out with this quick clean. He found it was splitting too many of his peas, so then he moved on to this cylinder, and now he's got this huge setup here. So he's been doing it for, I think, about 15 years now. But this has, you know, some sieves in it, and he's got, I forget how many tanks around there, but he can fill any of them out of, essentially, he just dumps into his pit and runs it up, and then can clean while he's harvesting. So that's obviously sort of the grand scale if you were really going to go get into this versus starting at sort of a more mediocre scale, which nothing wrong with starting that way. I think anybody who's been involved in innovation, I think actually the first person, you know, I'm a city kid, so I came from the city, and one of the first growers I got to know out here was actually John Ashman, and he said never experiment on a big scale to start with. He told me, he was like, always start off with that little 10 acre because you can have a train wreck, right? And then make it a little bigger. Yeah, and there's some people who don't follow that, I know. The other challenge I think is going to be planting dates, getting planting dates and depths worked out. You know, so the winter peas can flower actually in the winter or in the fall if we plant them too early. And so what I've been playing around with is putting the winter peas as sort of deep as I can put them, and putting the winter canola as shallow as I can put it, because usually we're going to have to push the pea date earlier back, earlier than we would want to seed peas in order to get that canola established, right? Because that canola is only going to push from so deep in the soil. And so we got to get it into moisture when there's still some moisture to be had near the surface. So I think there's going to be a lot of thought that needs to go into how we plant this. So if anybody has sort of a winged opener system and wants to try this, I'd love to talk with you, because I want to try shooting peas down the middle and then putting canola out the sides of the wings, so you can delay that pea emergence a little bit. So I think there's obviously a ton of work to be done here. So how do we compare these then? Like, right, you're going to put all this hassle into it. There's got to be some benefit. How would you want to compare these systems? Economics, somebody said economics. Yeah, ultimately, right, along our way, we want to look at your land efficiency, right? Because one of your costs is that you're putting this land into production. So can you actually get more off the same amount of land, right? How much can you yield off any certain piece of land? And then something I'm really interested in is, if we do this, can we start growing canola without any nitrogen inputs, right? Because that's another cost we can kind of take out of the equation then. So it all does come back to that money. And then also crop per drop, right? What's our water efficiency? So just want to introduce you to this this measurement that's really common in the literature. So if you start looking into intercrops, and it's called the land equivalence ratio. Essentially what you compare is you look at your intercrop yield compared to your monocrop yield of one crop, and your intercrop compared to your monocrop of another crop. So this would be like peas here, canola here, and then you add those up and you see if you're getting a system that's more efficient or less efficient than your monoculture. And what's interesting, this is from a sort of a meta-analysis done in Australia, is the cereal legume intercrops aren't really outperforming on a yield basis per acre, essentially what you would get if you were just monocropping those. So if you went and planted your legume and went and planted your cereal separately in a conventional system, I want to stress organic systems, I think these will frequently outperform the monoculture. But in a conventional system, they tended not to. Whereas the peaola, so this is from actual data in Australia, they're essentially, that's 150% yield would be right here, right? So they're getting quite a bit higher yields on a per acre basis. So then you have to take that back and say, okay, was all that extra hassle of figuring out my planting and cleaning my seed worth it? That's one comparison you can make. And then this is looking at, and I think this is one of the areas we need to do a lot of work in, is the relative yields. So right now, legume prices aren't that great, and so this is your relative pea yield to your relative canola yield. So in this instance, you were getting a really high LER, so that might look really good, like 200% yield. If you're getting only 50% of your canola yield and a lot more of your pea yield, so you have to look at the ratio of what you're actually pulling off there. And if the pea prices are way down and the canola prices are way up, then this is going to be a problem. And so I think we can control some of that probably by using different planting densities of the crops. I know there's some old literature out there on flax, actually, flax and garbs from, I think it was like the 20s or the 30s, some people were doing this kind of work, and they were showing that the seeding ratios would impact your relative yield of the different crops. So that's, I think, something that we need to consider in the economics of this. Does anybody have a number for winter peas right now, what the price is? 8 cents? There you go. Anybody a number for canola? 18? Yeah, and then you could get the non-GMO or GMO benefit, and this would be non-GMO probably. So those are just things to think of. So I have some experiments out on this right now. Unfortunately, I don't have data. We just planted last fall. These are the measurements we're hoping to take. We have these ones all funded, so we have water use efficiency, nitrogen response, phosphorus response. I don't have funding right now for AMF colonization or rotational benefits, but we're working on that. So that'll be kind of the next step. So that's going to be it for intercrops, unless somebody wants to talk more about it. We're going to start talking about cows. Yeah, so the question, which is an excellent question, is if the canola has such long root hairs, why is there less rhizosphere soil? No idea. I think it might be less density, and so the rhizosphere soil is ripping off easier, because in Australia they've been doing studies where they'll actually use that to compare, they'll use the amount of rhizosphere soil to compare root hair length and density on wheat variety trials. So right, you'll go through and you'll dig up a whole bunch of wheat plants and you shake off the rhizosphere soil, and then you'll weigh that, and that'll actually give you a sort of approximate of how many and how dense and how long the root hairs are. And I mean, Bill did work on, Bill Pan, if you don't know who I'm referring to, he did work on canola root hairs and lentil root hairs and flax way back in the day, and the canola is always one of the longest root hairs. So I think it has to do with density. So the question was, does growing peas in a box with canola increase the nodulation rates? We tried to get a difference on that, and we haven't really, most of this was sort of pilot studies, so we were running maybe 2 or 3 reps, which you really can't do anything statistical with, but there wasn't any trend with just that few reps. So if we really wanted to look at it, we'd have to run quite a bit more reps. But I agree, that's definitely a direction questions need to proceed, is are we upping nodulation with canola? So I always say when I started working with cows, I got brought onto this project because I was interested in winter canola survival, and my goal for the first year was to not kill any cattle. That's how much I know about cows, which we didn't kill any cows, so I'm pretty happy. So the sort of idea here from an economics and timing standpoint is that we would plant a canola grass mix here probably the first week of July. We would graze at some point in September. Once again, with the caveat, I don't know about cattle's. I've talked to a few cowboys that said this is when they run out of feed and they have to start switching over to bales. So it's sort of advantageous, right, that we can actually, if we can give them some more just grazing time there and push that winter feed stock back further so you don't have to start digging into it. Somewhere in December, the grass dies and the winter kills out, so this would be a summer or some sort of summer annual grass, and then we would take it through the next July, and that's where we would end up harvesting it. So once again, I see this primarily fitting into what has traditionally been the grain fallow region, right? So sort of what we're doing right now is we're planting wheat maybe sometime late August, maybe September, somewhere in here, maybe even October, right? And we're cropping it to around here, and then we've got all this time, right? And if we agreed at the start of this talk, one of our assumptions was active root growth is good, then this section here is bad, right? This is a part of the year where we're not getting anything done. So if we push that planting date back to the start of July here, what we do is we've essentially got ourselves 2 more months. You know, we haven't solved our problem. I think we're probably still losing organic matter in this system. But what we've done is we've actually pushed back a little bit into the start of, into July, and we've got some more active root growth going on. And so theoretically, right, we're feeding the microbes and a little more in this year, whereas really in this year here in our current system, the microbes pretty much aren't getting fed, right? So you're popping your wheat out of the ground, and then you're going into winter into a dormant system. And so really, the time that you're really getting active root growth is kind of right here. And that's the time you're feeding your microbes during. So that's sort of the theory I see going on here. The other place I could see this fitting is in places like Latah County, which is kind of funny, right? Because we don't really compare Latah County to the grain fallow very often. But driving around Latah County this last spring and summer, I saw a number of preventative plant fields, right? So actually right out next to the Parker farm, there's a really large field that never got planted this year, right? So say it is just too wet in the spring to get into your field at all. Could we go in with an earlier seeded canola and still take advantage of some of the growing degree days and maybe sop up some of that water earlier than, because this year that field that I drove past, I hope it's nobody in the room, because I wish I'd known you last spring and I could have tried to convince you of my crazy ideas here. That basically we could have planted, right? I think it got planted to wheat. I can't remember when it got planted, but I know I watched it got planted to wheat. And so then that would be an area here where we could push our seeding dates back further and get more active root growth in a system that's actually too much water, right? We always have too little or too much water. So that's where I see this fitting. Once again, the Australians and the Canadians, anytime you think you have a great idea, you start reading the literature and it's like, oh, guess what they're doing in Australia? And particularly John Kierkegaard, a researcher down there, he always seems to have been working on these ideas before I was even alive sometimes. So this is basically looking at relative yield of canola and grazing and what they found at earlier. And we would have to basically reset this whole calendar to our dates, but in their seasons, which it was July, much after July, they started seeing yield hits in their canola. So they're primarily grazing with sheep. Sheep are very different than cows, obviously, in their grazing habits, but something to think about. Theoretically, we can not lose yield and get some forage off of it. And that's kind of the golden scenario. Here's where we did this out in Dusty. This is 2017, 2018. You can see this is how hard we grazed it. So we pretty much annihilated the canola. I mean, this was an accident. We had grazed our first paddock, which is behind the picture, and it had taken the cows several days to go through it. So we moved them to the second paddock and left on Friday thinking, oh, they're going to be fine. Came back on Monday, and it had just taken them that first paddock to get their appetite up. And then once their appetite was up, they liked it and they screamed through it then after that. So there you go again. There's that picture, right? It doesn't look like anything's going to grow back there. Here's it in the winter. Here's some regrowth. Kind of what I want to point out in this picture, and it doesn't come out super good on the slide, at least from my angle, is there's a lot of leaves that were dying back. This was in like January that year, I think. We had a break in the snow, a funny break, and I went out and walked the fields a lot. And basically what I was seeing, I can't remember exactly when it was, but we saw a lot of leaf die back in the ungrazed. So this is grazed, ungrazed here in my little enclosure. This is the next year then. So we're pretty happy at flowering. So there's a shovel for your scale, and this is up on the hill outside of Dusty. That's my picture looking down into the plots. And then this is yields. So basically here's our grazing levels. So and they're not ordered by grazing level, they're ordered by pasture, but severe was that one I showed you the picture of. And we actually did get about 1,000 pound yield hit when we grazed it that hard. The light grazing basically got the same yield. What we did here was these are a 200-foot long strip that we cut, so it's not replicated, just how it was laid out. We couldn't really do that last year, so this year there'll be some more robust replication, but it was a 5-foot wide, 200-foot long strip with a plot combine. My thoughts with plot combines is that if anything, they're an underestimation of the actual yield because you lose so much when you're going through a big canola. And then, light and then heavy. So you can see there is definitely some grazing effect, or it looks like some grazing effect that we're hoping to follow up with our replicated studies here in the coming years. So then 2018-19, we tried to plant into a field that had some triticale already growing in it. So that didn't really work with the rain that year. And so we didn't get anything up in 18. 19, we went back into fallow, added some treatments. Basically, we went to this oat canola intercrop. In most of it, we tried 3 different canola varieties, and then we did ungrazed with growth regulators to see if we could control the size a little bit. And we planted in May. We were kind of got greedy after the 17-18 season, and we were like, oh, can we get 2 grazings off of it? And I really don't think that was a good idea now, hindsight. So here's our intercrop here, the oats and the canola, seeded in the same row but different seed boxes. The oats were put a little bit below the canola in this instance. And they kind of thought there was, once again, to get the canola a little more chance to get up. Oh, 10 minutes. Nice. We'll rock right through this here. So here's the pasture as it got a little bigger, a little older there. There's, when the cows came through, it was interesting. They grazed all the oats off to start with on the left side here, and then they went down and ate the canola next. So they kind of ate it down from the top. That's what it looked like this fall, right before winter. So interestingly, we pretty much, the grass is all droughted out. We saw some drought stress in the canola also, and that's why I think that May planting date is too early. We used up that profile pretty well, I'm pretty sure. As far as forage, it looks like it's a better idea to have the oats in there. The issues with canola, right, are you can be too low on dry matter so that there's not enough roughage to push it through the cow. Really high protein, so great from that standpoint. You can also get high nitrates. So those are kind of the things you have to watch on the cattle forage side. Basically, if you add the oats and you dilute that down some. We also had these cattle walking through tall wheat grass to and from their water, so if they needed more fiber, they could get more fiber. So that's kind of part of the design. We put out 8 moisture sensors, basically stations with 1, 2, 3, and 4 foot depths this year, and we've been monitoring that. And here's sort of the takeaway. They are all over the field, so they all started at different moisture, but if you look at the whole profile, so 1 would be the normalized at start of grazing, and then sort of the trend, and once again I haven't done any statistics on this, but the trend is that the non-grazed plots actually have less moisture in them after grazing than the grazed plots. And I've done some thinking about that. I think it might have been because we grazed it in July, so we shut off transpiration at that part of the season is kind of our thinking there. And so we actually slowed down our water uptake. So you might actually take up less water if you graze it than more, at least from this preliminary data set. So something I think we need to look into a lot more and do some more detailed sampling on. This was the second grazing by aphids. So that's the other problem with the really early planting. Here's the first grazing by cattle, so you can actually see where they clipped it off and then it started to regrow, and then aphids came in and it got drought stressed, so we never got 2 grazings. So at this point in time, I think 2 grazings is a little bit greedy of us, and we're probably going to focus on just doing 1 graze. So I think the advantages here are we can decrease fallow time, and basically that's the same as increasing the duration of active root and growth. And then we can also increase some species diversity because we don't just have canola now, or we don't just have wheat, we have canola, oats, and cattle. What other forages you want in there? You could add some other forages in there too. So, and I guess this is my controversial statement. I think some of these options might be better than thinking about annual forages, and some of these other systems might be better than thinking about cover crops for our systems. And that's it. So thank you very much. Questions? Okay, I have bonus slides if there's no questions, but I'd love questions more than bonus slides. Oh yeah, sorry, question was what seeding rates are we using on the intercrops? Are we going down to 1/2? Are we going down to 2/3? And right now I'm closer to 2/3, and I'm just doing that to actually make sure I get stands up. I think one of the studies that really needs to be done on this is a change in seeding rates. Yeah, and I do think there is, looking at the relative seeding rates is one of the things that we need to start looking at, and we can start kind of controlling, based on the economics and the prices. If we could get to a point where we're not putting any nitrogen on canola, and we're getting a pretty decent canola yield and some pea yield in the current pricing, that could be a really lucrative system then to move into. That's the way I actually see this paying off, because there's obviously a ton of extra work here that people aren't going to really want to do unless there's some pretty big payoff. On the light duty grazing, what percentage of the foliage was removed? We didn't actually measure how much was removed. Pretty much all the big leaves were taken off. So every time we basically grazed it down to something that was just a little stub. That is a mixed herd. There were some steers in that too, actually. Does anybody want to see a bonus slide? Okay. This is a totally different topic, right? I want to talk about subsoil micronutrients and immobile nutrients. Here, zinc, we traditionally think of it being in the topsoil because it's immobile. But when we got all these samples from the variety trials around the state, we found there was actually more at depth than we were aware of. And so I went through these immobile nutrients and looked at ratios here. So basically, if you're above the blue line, it means more of that nutrient is actually stored in the subsoil than the topsoil. So in this instance, copper, even though we consider it immobile, more of it is actually being stored in the subsoil. So I teach soil fertility, right? What I teach you in soil fertility is that you need to sample the topsoil for things like copper and things like potassium and things like phosphorus. But when we looked at these samples from the variety trials all across the state, what we were actually finding was there was more in the subsoil than we knew about. And there's active debate whether the roots are actually accessing that. There have been work done in Australia where they did actually show that zinc, specifically subsoil zinc, was influencing the grain at the end of the season. So just something to think about there. And it's another project that I'm kind of working on the side because Ryan Higginbotham, before he left WSU, gave me this really great data set from his variety trials and said, yeah, if you want to make anything out of it, make something out of it. So this is what I've made out of it. So I called topsoil 0 to 1 foot depth, and I called subsoil anything 2 to 4. Thank you very much.